Welcome back to the Restoring Darkness podcast. On today's show, Mark and I are very pleased to be joined by Dana Zartner. She is a teacher, lawyer, and writer whose work centers on the use of international and comparative law as tools for social justice advocacy, with an emphasis on environmental justice, the right to a healthy environment, Indigenous rights, sustainable development, and the rights of nature. A professor at the University of San Francisco, she has published numerous articles and essays on these topics, including the recent The Right to Night, New Legal Advocacy Strategies to Address Terrestrial Light Pollution in Environs. She also has a book coming out with Island Press on March 4th, 2025, entitled Standing for Nature, Legal Strategies for Environmental Justice, which examines existing rights of nature laws around the world with an eye to cresting legal advocacy strategies for future endeavors. In addition to her academic work, Dana has served as an accredited representative at various UN meetings, including the Committee on Women's Rights in New York and the Expert Mechanisms on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in Geneva. She has also done pro bono work with the 1 Million Tree campaign in Cambodia and in support of the Ama Mutsun tribal band's efforts to protect their traditional lands in Santa Clara County. Outside of her day job, Dana enjoys the natural beauty of Northern California, writes travel essays with an environmental theme, plays with her cats, and is working on a novel. I believe that her social media, Scott, will be in the show notes on Restoring Darkness or YouTube or wherever you are encountering this work. But before we get to Dana, we have to go to the Soft Lights Report with Mark Baker because we're always fascinated about what Mark's up to. What do you got, Mark?
Hi, Michael. Just a brief update today. This week, I was supposed to have a very important hearing in federal court, in my lawsuit against the Food and Drug Administration and National Highway Traffic Safety Administration for failing to test and evaluate LED headlights. As you know, I'm not a lawyer, it's a federal lawsuit, so I'm sort of excluded from some of the messages. So I got online the night before, make sure my case was still on, and it said off calendar. I was like, oh, what does that mean, off calendar? So I hunted around. I do have what's called a Pacer account, and I found it. And it turns out that the judge has decided not to hear oral arguments at this time. I guess apparently the judge will be reviewing the case, looking at the documentation, looking at my claim, and deciding whether the claim can move forward. The FDA and the NHTSA, represented by the Department of Justice, of course, are trying to get the case dismissed for some reason. They don't want to have to evaluate LED headlights. So that's the status of that case.
Well, as Mark is operating in the justice courts, we're also going to do some work in the court of public opinion, like we were talking about earlier. And I think that I'm not sure which one's more powerful, Mark. I think they're both pretty up there.
They both are important, Michael.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
you got to have both. Dana, wow, welcome to the show.
Good morning.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
As are we. The right to night. Is it a right?
Well, if you ask myself and my co-authors, we definitely think it's a right. It goes to what is just such a long-standing debate. Are rights inherent? Are they natural? Or are they only things that are given to us by the state or institutions? And I would argue that among the other human rights that we have, simply because we're human beings, we have a right to a healthy environment. And I would include the right to the night in there, the right to the night sky, the right to be as healthy as we can be, which, as we know, more and more information is coming out about the adverse effects of, this constant light that is affecting so many things. So, it's always tricky to use the language of rights because it's something that speaks to people, but so many people have a very definitive idea about what rights are. Your right to freedom of speech or your right to your religion, right? Those are the way it gets talked about, and it's a very kind of individualistic idea. My right to X, at least in many of the the places that have kind of built their rights on that Enlightenment era, your Hobbes and Locke and Montesquieu, right to life, liberty, and property kind of basis, where particularly when we're talking about rights related to the environment or to nature, nature has always been thought of as, below us in the hierarchy as a commodity. And so crafting this idea about rights around that, which is really about more a group right or a communal right than an individual right, it brings up a lot of tension for people. But I mean, my personal view is that yes, we do have that right. It's part of our right to live, it's part of our right to a healthy environment and to have a life of dignity. Um, and I do think that we do see this trend, right? I think this is a component of the broader movement that's happening around the world about the rights of nature, the right to a healthy environment, and the recognition that so many of the other rights that we talk about, there's an underlying, natural or environmental component to them. Because if we don't have a healthy planet, if we don't have forests and clean water and night skies, that has an impact on all our other rights. So they're very interconnected in that way. But it is a challenge to have those conversations. And, you just mentioned the courts of justice and the courts of public opinion. And this is the same, two sides are part of this debate, because it's not just about changing our law, it's about changing people's minds
Mm.
about what rights means and what we consider under this umbrella as we work to, provide better protections for everybody.
It's interesting because within this movement, I've done a lot of light trespass mitigations where personally I go and evaluate the problem. And I feel like the right is on the other side. The person feels like they have the right to light pollute, and that telling them they can't create light pollution is like anti-American or something. It seems like it's tied up into this ethos of, I have my rights and these rights are mine and you can't tread on them. But really, how do we understand it if somebody has a right to illuminate their property, which they do? I do believe people have not a right, but they're allowed to illuminate their properties. I don't know if right is the right word, but they butts up against other people's spaces, which light trespass. So is there a legal basis to that claim, or is that just an opinion? Are you actually saying that there is a right to darkness? There's a right to night?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not written anywhere at this point that there's a right to the night. I mean, there are places working on it. It's not the United States. I don't believe even in Canada, they're actively working on creating, codifying a right to the night. But I mean, and this is what we talk about in the Right to Night article, that so much of it is about pushing for new interpretations of the existing laws. And, you're absolutely right. And this comes up often with, ideas about new rights or the environmental rights, is there is this conflict. There's a conflict of rights between, our right to do what we want with our personal property and our right to develop. And, there are those aspects. And on the other side, there's this, again, which tends to be a more communal idea about we have the right to darkness. And, I think what's really important, and a partner, John and I talk about it in the article, but it's also a big theme of this Rights of Nature book that I have coming out, is that it's not a zero sum game, right? It's not all or nothing. And that to really be successful in kind of pushing these ideas forward is, and it's part about winning that the changing human perceptions about where the environment fits in, is that we do have to balance. I mean, you can't just go in and say you have to turn off all your lights, because people are going to have that immediate reaction of, no, you're infringing on what I need to do. But, talking about things like maybe you don't need so many lights, maybe you need different kinds of light bulbs. Really, do they need to be on all night long? And sort of working within, and different communities, different cultures, different contexts are going to, be at different places when we're talking about them, with areas where there are lots of Indigenous communities where the night sky is so culturally and spiritually important, right? It might be an easier argument to make that we need to balance. But in other places, particularly in places like the United States or many of the Western countries, where it does tend to be more individualist. There was a psychologist named Geert Hofstede many years ago who did this big study, and one of the things he measured was the individualism and the communalism of different countries. And the more individualist a country was, that it's more about my right to do X, Y, and Z. And the more communal, it's thinking about the public good, the bigger whole. And the United States was the most individualistic country in the world, followed closely by Australia and Canada and New Zealand. And so there is this tension. And so part of the work we have to do is, not go in with this idea of you should be doing this. What you're doing is bad, but finding a way to show people that it's really in everybody's good to minimize. And that, yeah, you do. I mean, in our society today, we cannot turn off all the lights at night. It's just not going to happen. And so finding ways to do better, though, is what this is about. And, there is a debate about couching these kinds of movements in terms of rights. But by doing so, it is easier to get people's attention because it goes to that, human nature to think about my rights. And so, it is one of the biggest challenges we have. And should this ever get to courts, for example, right? Courts in the United States already have a whole bunch of balancing tests that they use, depending on the issues and who's involved. Different contexts, so, the Canadian courts tend to do things on more of a case-by-case basis. But within that, there's still this idea of you've got to balance rights and how do we minimize the most harm for the maximum number of people. And so what I think we're looking at in the future as we continue to move this forward is building that kind of thing into what we're asking people to do, or what we're trying to convince people would be in the interests of the public good.
So Dana, in this, you've written this book along with, you said John, I believe it is John Barentine.
John Barentine and Parna Venkatasan, who I think we've both been on the podcast before.
Okay, great. So, you've written this book, and now there's this challenge: is what to do with that information. How will the courts then use that, or how will the public use it? So, is there an effort on your part, or anybody then to push it through the courts to make it test it, right? Test your theory. I believe in Montana that some children sued for the right to a clean environment. Yep. And so it took a couple of years, but they tested that theory. Is there something that you're a part of that's going to be similar to test this theory?
Well, there's a lot going on right now. So yes, there have been cases that, and we talk about it in the article, the Right to Night article, where Held versus Montana is the one that you reference. One of the first big ones in the U.S. was the Juliana case, where a number of students brought a case against the government for not doing enough to stop climate change generally. And so it's this idea of the public interest, and that's one of the things we talk about in the article, is that when we're thinking about the law, because historically, if somebody's lights are upsetting you, you file a small claim under nuisance law in the United States. And nuisance law is very specific. It's just targeted essentially to you and your neighbor. It has a very narrow, if they decide in your favor, right, it's just between you. It doesn't have any kind of bigger implications. But public interest cases, of course, and the idea of the public trust, right, and all these big environmental spaces that are in the public trust, those cases they're usually against the government, or the government and big entities like corporations. And so they have a bigger impact if they are decided. The health case was really amazing because not only did the court decide that the young people had a right to a healthy environment and the state of Montana needed to do more, but right, it happened in Montana, which is a more conservative state within the United States. And, this is an area that tends to be thought of as sort of, a liberal environmental kind of movement. And so it was a really monumental decision for them to take. But the Constitution of Montana provides for a right to healthy environment. When you think about it, right, it's a very outdoorsy state and they're very proud of their natural heritage. So there's a lot of work building on that. But there have been some efforts in the U.S. to be more broad and sort of focus on this right to nature idea. The biggest one was probably a few years ago, the citizens of Toledo, Ohio, drafted a a statement for public referendum giving rights to Lake Erie, because Lake Erie is constantly polluted and it provides drinking water for so many. And it passed the public referendum, but then the next day, one of the farms, the big farms that puts runoff into the lake, brought a lawsuit. And surprisingly fast for courts, the judge ruled for the farm and against the bill. And the bill was very important in terms of the lake has a right to exist and flourish, and it ties into people's right to a healthy environment. But the provision, the law, was written very vaguely, and it was just too vague for the courts to uphold it, so they struck it down. But slowly but surely, we're seeing a little bit more of that, but it's all at the local level. I don't think we're going to see a national effort in the United States about the right to the night or the rights of nature, and probably not in a lot of the Western countries. There's been a little bit of effort in Europe, but there's nothing national yet. We're seeing it happen in places like New Zealand and Colombia and Bangladesh. There have been some efforts in India, Peru, Bolivia. They are passing national legislation that gets to some of these ideas. But one of the things that the book talks about a lot that's not necessarily in the article is just what are the legal strategies that have worked in those cases that we might be able to use. But again, we're up against, certain institutional and kind of cultural factors in places like the US that's going to make it a bigger or a harder thing to do. But people are working on it. One thing that I'm interested in doing, we haven't started yet, is sometimes it just takes you have to start small, and you have to start local, and this would be true to the right to darkness or any other kind of right to the night or any other kind of right of nature in this way. And so, in California, we have the redwoods, which are unique and are, so important. And I think something like that, like starting a campaign to protect the rights of the redwoods, would be a good place to start. Or the communities that are engaging in the dark skies, right, and being part of the Dark Skies Initiative. Many of the work so far hasn't really specifically talked about the right to the night, but that could be brought in as part of that. But it's really because there's nothing specific written in the laws that we have really anywhere at this point. It's about creatively interpreting the laws that we do have and finding a way then to apply it. And there was just a case in Europe. It was the European Court of Human Rights just a couple of weeks ago decided a case in favor of some Italians against the Italian government who were suffering from pollution as a result of toxic chemicals. And the court said that the Italian government was responsible, and that the pollution like that is actually a violation of the right to life. And it was the first time a court has ever really attached pollution like that to the right to life in that way. And in that specific case, they were talking about toxins in the groundwater. But I can imagine something similar talking about light pollution that pushes that. And it's more likely to happen first in a place like Europe or like Latin America. But, it's one of the frustrating things about the law. And we make this point in the article, right? It's a slow tool. Like, courts move very slowly, and your results are never guaranteed. But at the same time, so it's important because if you can change the law or get new interpretations, that's really helpful to a movement. But it's only one tool, right? You can't just rely on the law. You have to do the same kind of community building and community work and education and mobilizing and all of those kinds of things that go along with it. But it is an additional and important tool to kind of push. It frustrates people because it works so slowly in so many instances.
Well, the good news is we can always count on the United States to do the right thing, but only after they've exhausted every other option. Okay.
Yeah.
So
I don't even know how to respond to that. I will say this. There are certain states within the United States that you can count on to make efforts to do the right thing. And it's always been that way, from the time of the case Massachusetts versus the Environmental Protection Agency, when they won the right to have stricter admission standards in certain states than others, right? There is this group of states that makes an effort. And I think, that's where we have to start. That's where that's where we're seeing more dark skies movements happening. That's where we're more likely to see, if not actual law, public sentiment change around some of these.
Yeah,
ideas,
I'm going to jump in. I'm going to interrupt you because I actually, I don't want to interrupt you, but I have to right now because I think part of the problem is the term dark sky. I think that's a
Yeah.
major part of the problem. I think that there is definitely, like, Dark Sky International does a great job with protecting the celestial heritage and highlighting it, doing dark sky preserves. But what Mark Baker has really brought right in front of me in this movement is the impact of electric illumination, specifically LEDs, on a diurnal species like humans. Like, there are real acute health impacts caused by light pollution. Now, you can say we got to start small and at the local level and all this kind of stuff, but the LED rollout didn't start small and at the local level. The LED rollout was done internationally as a entire lumens per watt, energy efficiency, climate change. We're doing this for the environment. Everybody's got to change all their lights to LED. And I'm just going to say, I think it's a catastrophe. I think what we've done, you're talking about light pollution going up 10% a year. The U.S. light pollution heat map is entirely light polluted from the East Coast to the middle of America. That entire block of land is entirely light polluted. And so, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. So I'm not sure it's realistic to say we can start at the local level. I think we have to start swinging big like Mark is after the FDA and NHTSA and these folks, and really hitting hard at the higher levels. You'd mentioned cultural factors. What are the cultural factors? When you say there's cultural factors in this, what are they?
Yeah. So, I mean, first, I absolutely agree with you. And, when we talk about these things, like in the paper and the book, right, we talk about multi-level activism or advocacy on this issue, meaning you got to go to the local level, the state level, the national level, the international level. You have to hit them all at the same time. Realistically, right now, if we're just talking about the United States, the national level is a really big hurdle. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't try it. And the point you make about when these things happen that contribute to these problems, they always seem to happen really fast and they're massive, and then the responses are just small and kind of targeted, and there's an imbalance there.
Sure.
And it's something that, as like, advocates are trying to figure out, how do you respond to these big things with something just as big when you don't have the money and the resources and the access that the companies do or the governments do. But I absolutely agree that it's not enough to just do one thing. You need to do it all. And, I do think that, with the rights of nature, generally that kind of effort is happening in a lot of places. Like, they are going right to big national conversations and efforts. In the US, in Canada, and some of the bigger European countries, it hasn't quite happened yet, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't. Just the efforts that we need to do. And then what was your second question? I'm sorry, I
It was
forgot.
you mentioned, when you were talking, you mentioned that there's cultural factors.
Yeah.
And like, I heard that, and I was hoping you were going to tell me what they were. So now I'm asking you,
Yeah.
what are the cultural factors that are preventing us from abating light pollution?
Yeah. So this is an area of law that not a lot of people talk about, because, right, so much about law is just building within the institutional structures of, you create the law, you pass the law, you implement the law, you comply with the law. But there's a second aspect to that, and that is how the law is implemented in a community and accepted in a community. And that's where we get to this question of legal culture or cultural factors. And so, taking a country like the US again, and Canada is very similar to the US in this way, kind of built on these traditions, these settler traditions, these kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, again, getting to that idea of individualist traditions, where communities with more communal ideas, like the Indigenous communities, were really tamped down, and their ideas were taken out of the conversation. All of that drives how we think about the natural world, how we think about the night, how we think about really anything. And so it's a contrast to cultures or communities like, Asian cultures, for example, where they're much more communal by nature, right? It's not about your own personal well-being, it's about the good of the community. And communities, right, communities with the monotheistic religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, right, they tend to view things one way. But communities with sort of polytheistic traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, right? They have different views about nature. And so you look at religion, you look at history, you look at cultural connection to the sky or the river or the mountain or whatever it is. And then you look at how that has shaped perception. And so, again, in much of well, certainly in the United States, right, the idea about the environment has always been that it's there for us to own. It's there for us to use. And yes, there have been movements about creating national parks and things like that. But even that, it's a very anthropogenic view of it, right? We're creating national parks so we can go look at the pretty parks. It's not we're creating natural parks because that ecosystem is important in and of itself. And that's really what it boils down to when we're looking at some of these environmental ideas, is how do people view that human nature connection? Do they see themselves as above nature, or do they see themselves as part of an integrated, holistic whole relationship with all other living things? Because that shapes how they view the law that is acceptable. And going back to, the point that you made about, right, somebody's like, well, it's my property, I could do what I want on my own property, right? That is very much that ideal. Whereas in other cultures, right, nobody owns property. Land is not there to own. We are caretakers, we are stewards of the land while we're here, and our job is to protect it and preserve it, not only for people today but also for future generations, right? That's the underlying cornerstone of this idea of sustainability. And so communities where that is part of the cultural worldview, having these conversations about, protecting the night sky or protecting some other kind of natural entity or phenomena, you have a different starting point. It doesn't mean that they all don't have different kinds of challenges that you have to use, but it it's a different starting point for a conversation. So if I have these kinds of conversations with people in the United States, I have to do a lot more explaining. I kind of have to do what we're talking about, is go and give a little bit of history about, no, it doesn't mean that the night sky has exactly the same rights as you, right? We know that the sky can't have human rights in that way, but this is what it means. It means we are recognizing the night sky as important for itself, but also for how it impacts us and all other living things on the planet. And we're recognizing it's kind of that argument of, we're recognizing it as a legal person so that it does have some kind of standing to protect itself and to, I don't want to use the word force, but to encourage us to protect it. And so just depending on, and it's one of the things that lawyers often skip, is looking at really what is happening in the community, because they're so used to focusing on the law as it's written that they don't necessarily take into account, why is it that way? And what do these changes we want to make, or these new ideas that we want to instill, like how does that matter? How does that fit in with what a community is currently doing?
Mm.
Well, Dana, that you brought up something. I was going to ask you a different question, but you brought something up. I'm going to ask you this. So, this corporation. So, in the United States, we're often hearing that a corporation is a person. Now, I disagree with that, but I've seen this a lot. A corporation is a person in the United States. And so, the movement that you're talking about to that well, the knight is a person, or could have human rights. Is there has this been thought about to give nature the same level of right as a corporation? You mentioned that farm in Lake Erie they won the case or something, but it would seem to me that if they're going to say, if they're going to expand the definition of human to include corporations, that definition of human should extend to the night sky as well. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, that's the exact argument that I make, particularly in the book, which has more space to
Okay.
expand on this. But that's just it. And again, it's one of those things where it can get a little muddled, because when people say, well, the sky has rights, or the sky is a legal person, right? Legal personhood is not the same as human personhood. Legal personhood is a constructed fiction, right? We could make anything a legal person, and that's what we've done with corporations. Definitely in the United States, which has some of the strongest protections, because the Supreme Court has given corporations many of the same rights in the Bill of Rights that humans do have. But it varies in other places around the world, this idea that corporations are legal fictions or legal persons. But we do it with other things too, right? States, like the United States and Canada, we talk about them as a unitary entity. We treat them like legal persons, and they are. Like in international law and the international system, it is the state that is the person. It's not the persons within the state, although we know that, of course, the persons within the state are actually doing the action. The same is true with, churches, right? We give churches legal rights. They are legal persons. In some places, animals have gotten legal rights. They're legal persons. And so it's not a new idea to say the sky has legal personhood or the mountain. New Zealand is probably the furthest ahead on this, and they've given legal personhood, legal rights to a forest, a mountain, or a river, and then just very recently a mountain. And the way if you read the law, it's very specific. It's not they have the same rights as human beings. They have legal personhood, which particularly in common law based countries like ours means that they have standing to go to court to protect themselves. And so if someone harms the entity, there's a basis to go to court without a person having to say, oh, the river's been polluted, that affects me, I'm going to go to court, because that's a much more indirect kind of case to bring. And in countries where, having standing is a difficult thing, having the basis to have your lawsuit heard, where for most, like at least in the United States, right, for me to have standing to bring a suit, I have to be able to show the direct harm was on me. And with things like pollution, that can be really hard because, the company is polluting, spewing things into the air. How it's very hard to say, okay, that percentage of that company's pollution has affected me. And courts have been very unwilling to hear those kind of cases if you can't show that direct connection. So what this does is it says the air. And nobody's brought a case about the air, but the air could bring the suit because it is being polluted. And that's a more direct link. And so, in theory, it's the same argument.
I think we've lost Dana here, Mark, and we'll wait for her to. Oh, she's back.
They're having a bad reaction to it. How can nature possibly have these legal rights? And part of it is the way things are phrased or shaped, because people do tend to say, oh, they have the same rights as human beings, which, lawyers are all about the details. And then you're like, well, technically that's not true. It's not human rights. It's legal personhood. And what was interesting about that Lake Erie case is the farm that brought the suit, right? They brought it as the farm. So as a corporation, as a legal person, and in nothing in their arguments actually criticized the legal personhood of Lake Erie. They talked about how the law was vague and how it infringed on their due process rights and that kind of thing, but they didn't go after that central idea. And I don't know this for a fact, but if they had done that, right, that would open them up to this very conversation, because you're going to criticize this for being a legal person, but yet you're a legal person. And so, this idea has been around for a long time. It's just every time you want to expand it to a new something, there's always this kind of push, this backlash about it.
Okay, so this personhood idea that you place upon corporations or parts of nature, mountains, rivers, whatever it is, I could see how a lot of people individual citizens would be kind of uncomfortable with that. Not legal professionals would understand it, whether on either side, that they understand what's happening. A lot of people will have a hard time making the distinction between human rights and legal personhood. That's going to be tough. But I see a bigger problem for us, Dana, and that is that light pollution is not considered pollution by any of these agencies. The EPA, Environment Canada, the Ministry of the Environment in Ontario, they talk about lighting ordinances, but it's always in this nuisance realm that, bad lighting is a nuisance. It's not pollution. It's not toxic. And even, when we've interviewed other scientists, Mark, there's been this insistence that you cannot call light carcinogenic. That's not what it is. Electric light is not carcinogenic, although it does cause cancer. It's so like there's this problem with actually saying, you know what, electric light causes a lot of problems, and we need to solve this, and it needs to be legally declared by the EPA as hazardous waste. Like wasted light at night is hazardous waste. Like, how do we get to that? I think that's another route. This personhood thing with different entities is one avenue to pursue. But do we need to go to the EPA and say, hey, it's time to make light pollution pollution, buddy? Like, is it time for that?
I mean, I absolutely think so. I think that, right, and again, it's about doing all the avenues. You need to go to the EPA, you need to go to all the professional organizations, you need to, and like, convince them that light pollution is pollution. And, the more, of course, the more we see studies come out about the damaging effects, the more evidence then there is to build. Um, on the legal side, and, this is one of the things I love about the law, even though it's really, slow, is that, right, this is where we get creative. And there is so much room to ask for that interpretation within existing laws that don't require and necessarily the courts to say light pollution is pollution, although it would be great if they did. But instead of worrying about what it's being called, it's more about the effects. And so that's the argument that we make in the article about going through existing human rights mechanisms like the European Court just did. We're using the right to life, which is arguably the most fundamental human right we have, to say yes, pollution is part of that. And they weren't talking about light pollution in that case, but I can absolutely see a lawyer bringing a case saying, okay, you've already said this about pollution interferes with the right to life. So now we want you to expand into other kinds of pollution, including light pollution. Now, again, that's going to be a harder sell in a place like the United States, but I can still see it as a possibility if you can tie the light pollution to some fundamental right that is being infringed on. Because that's what the courts will grab onto. And again, recognizing the difficulty of doing this because it doesn't create, right, big instantaneous change. I can see courts in Hawaii or in California or in Massachusetts or in Washington accepting that, making a decision like they did in the Held versus Montana, like they did in the early rounds of the Juliana case, where they accept that interpretation. Now, that isn't going to make national change, but it's going to push it in that direction, because then the more states we have that do that, right, we're looking for that tipping point. We're looking for that tumble effect. But yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. We're in this place with this issue where we know that it is bad, that it is having all these detrimental effects, and trying to convince people of that is so difficult. Um, and the law is just one way to do that. But we still need to do all the other things, and push, at a bigger level. And unfortunately, we're at this very difficult moment where I'm not sure there's anybody at the national level who's going to want to listen at this point. But it doesn't mean you stop trying, right? Again, this goes back to it's not a zero-sum game. It's either you get it or you don't. It's a continuous spectrum where you keep working until somebody somewhere hears you and pushes to make the
Yes.
change. It's just, which is
Yes.
hard and it's frustrating and it requires a lot of patience and persistence, right? Everything we know about advocacy on an issue, but can be so frustrating when you see the effects, hitting people every day, and the change just doesn't come fast enough.
Mark can attest to the effects for sure, but sometimes it feels like these kinds of movements. Not only is the cart before the horse, but somebody stuck the carrot up its butt or something, and it's bucking around. You know what I mean?
I
Yeah.
do. I do. Yeah. And it's one of the things I talk about with my students all the time, because they're so passionate about everything and they want to
Yes.
do everything. And
Yes.
you can't do everything. And you really need to be effective. You have to plan, and you have to be narrow, and you really have to think through, like, where am I going to be most effective and where am I likely to get closest to what I'm trying to go for, and not let all the other, because there's so much other stuff happening that's all important, but focusing on these narrow issues, which, light pollution is a narrow issue within this broader, all the environmental things that are happening. So yeah, I absolutely agree. And it takes a lot, right? It
But
is hard because you are always, um, who was it? Was it Sisyphus who was constantly pushing the rock up the hill
Yes.
to then have it roll right back down on him? That
But that
that kind of
existential
thing.
angst that we see in our young people, okay, like I see it everywhere. There's almost, I'm never going to be able to buy a house. My life is going to be shitty. I'm going to live with my parents till I die, and all this kind of stuff. I think that there's an escapism in that where they're kind of buying into a negative narrative of depression or anxiety when in fact I think that a change of focus to something specific like light pollution, where we're
Yeah.
moving the needle forward every day. Mark's grinding away at soft lights. We're up here with Restoring Darkness. We're creating podcasts. We're pushing against this thing, and I'm starting to see, Mark, the tipping point. I'm starting to see it down the road that this movement is going to take hold on the lighting industry, which is the most important of all the industries for this to take hold, because the lighting industry is the one that's going to solve it, Mark Baker.
Well, Michael, you've said that, but sorry for the cough there. Yeah, but it's so big. It is not just the lighting industry, and we've got regulatory issues, and we've got these legal issues and stuff, and we've got to push that through too. And we've got these local problems. I've got somebody contacting me in Missouri who's got a church across the street, and they put in a big floodlight, and the church wants it for safety. And this has been going on for years, and she's documented her health effects so bad. She's documented that she can't sleep, and she's been taken to the hospital because of that light. And the church says, well, but it's important for the safety of our parishioners. And there's a lot to this big problem. Do you mind if I just jump back to something that you said earlier, Dana?
Yeah.
Smoking. This was a big deal. Smoking cases in the U.S. And if light pollution, we have one research study on our website that shows that light pollution causes early mortality. So in the United States, do we have this right to life? And if the light pollution companies, and here maybe Michael, that is the lighting industry, that if they're causing the increase in cancer, just like the cigarette companies did, there was a multi-hundred-billion-dollar lawsuit. It took decades or something. But is there a tie there that is so similar to me? And then we're not even choosing to smoke. We're being forced to inhale this light pollution and suffer this increase in cancer risk.
Yeah. No, I think it's a great analogy to have. And I absolutely, I can see a big class action suit brought. And, again, going back to the earlier point about right, the rollout of all these light bulbs and everything happened so fast and it was everywhere. Well, that is exactly the kind of thing. It's everywhere. So then that creates a different thing. And that was like the cigarettes, right? Cigarettes were everywhere and the advertisements were everywhere and the health effects were everywhere. And so, yes, absolutely, I can see parallels to that where I could see when they're gathering the data from people all over with different different kinds of, like with the church but other things happening, and then bringing a suit to that. And so I think that's part of it. Exactly what you said is to just say I'm gonna file a suit because light pollution is affecting people badly, like that. It's jumping, as you said, like jumping, putting the cart before the horse in there. But saying, do you remember the cigarette cases? Like, do you remember when the courts decided that smoking had adverse effects, indirect adverse effects as well as direct adverse effects? And it's the same thing here. And provide people with those examples, I think, is so important in something like this, because for most people they're not really thinking about it in that way. And just even saying, oh, there's lots of studies that are saying how bad light pollution is, people aren't going to go and read those studies for the most part. And so, but that is tangible. Remember the smoking cases? No, do you enjoy the fact that people can't smoke inside anymore? Most people are probably going to say yes. And it gives them a concrete example that's relevant to them. Because again, you're always more effective with the law if you can make people see how it affects their immediate existence. I think that's a great, example to use to build these kinds of not just legal cases, but just generally when, having these conversations and trying to, educate and communicate about the issue. It's something people are going to recognize and be able to say, oh, yeah, I see the parallels there. I think, it's a great idea.
Are you saying that light pollution is addictive? Like, I mean, there's something happening here that we seem to like it seems to be an ever increasing problem that the more light pollution we have, the more light pollution we have. It just seems to be more and more and more, and people have grown accustomed to it. But I'll tell you this before we wrap up here, Mark and Dana, there is something I'll tell you. Once you point it out to people, they can't unsee light pollution. Once it's been pointed out to them, it's disgusting.
Yeah.
You know, like
Yeah.
and I'm not talking about starry skies and, seeing the Milky Way in San Francisco. I got news for everybody listening to this. You're not going to see the Milky Way in Toronto anytime soon, unless there's a major blackout. Okay? So, and you get lucky with clear skies on that night. But the fact is that we can do a lot at the local level and with, the kind of mitigation stuff I've been working on, the stuff you've been working on, Mark. Before we close off, Dana, do you have any final thoughts for the Restoring Darkness crowd?
Well, really, there's one thing I wanted to respond to something you said about young people.
Sure.
Because I know exactly what you're talking about, the sort of the overwhelmedness, and it's kind of causing them to shut down. But on the opposite end of that, just to kind of end on maybe a more hopeful note, what I see in my classes, and my classes all tend to be environmentally oriented in some way, I actually see the opposite of that. And granted, my university is very social justice driven and we're in San Francisco, but I see a lot of passion and a lot of spark among the students to try to find different ways to make things better. And we've actually talked about this issue in class because of the article. And most of them really were not aware, right? They had never thought about it. But then, as you just said, once they thought about it, like they come into class to me all the time now and say, oh my God, I was somewhere last night and it was just so, and I just it's like they're so aware now. And they're really, they're still trying to figure it out and they're overwhelmed by everything. They're still in that kind of, oh my gosh, there's so much. But I see so much passion in them to, do the work to make things better. So I know that, right, there's all sides of it, but just to give you a little hopeful anecdote, I do see, some very passionate young people, and it inspires me. It is really kind of helping me not go down a cycle of, oh my God, everything is so terrible, because I see in them this spark. So hold on to that, if nothing else.
We love you, young folks. Believe me, Mark Baker and Michael Colligan, we don't want to be the hosts of this podcast. We'd love it if you guys would step up and steal this job from Mark and I. We want to see new people in this movement. We just had a great interview with Rachel Cureja yesterday. He's 15 years old. He started a light pollution abatement movement, Princia.org, which was so encouraging to see the young people and that. But yeah, get specific. Get into it. Get into the details. Get into the weeds, folks. That's where the problems are solved. Stepping back and saying everything's terrible and throwing the towel in, we don't want that. We need you. We need you to help us out. All you young people out there, we need you to have hope in the future. And you know what? I'm going to say one more thing. The mayor of my town got elected on 4,500 votes out of 42,000. Most people aren't voting in their local elections. Light pollution is decided right now at the local level. Please, Ontario has a big election right now. Please go vote. I don't care who you vote for. Most important thing is to vote. So especially at the local level, it's the most important thing. And any Canadians listening out there, don't worry about the American president. Worry what's happening in your town, in your own town, okay? In your own town. Don't worry about that. He's a wild man. He says lots of crazy things. So go to restoringdarkness.com. I tried to stop, but I had to do it. So thank you for listening, folks. All you folks out there, of course, Dana Zartner, what a wonderful pleasure it has to have you on the show, and especially hear about all your students. I love hearing how excited they are. That's great.
They're great.
Thanks for coming on.